happy 4th of July. And Larry, I know that that is not a big holiday in London, but it's an interesting day because it was the declaration of, it celebrates the declaration of independence from the King of England and the country of England. And, you know, we're pretty brazen and arrogant about that independence and celebrating it with illegal fireworks and beer and hot dogs and all those American things. And yet, of course, we're very tied to England, and there's this weird fascination with the crown and the royal family and princesses and a real affinity between the two countries. Today is not a history lesson. I'm not a history professor. I think many of you could do that part better than I. But I do think there's some interesting things from a Zen perspective in a declaration of independence. Because if we look at those two words in themselves, and then even if at some of the text in the Declaration of Independence, which I did read again, declaring, right? Declaring something into existence is a very specific and powerful act. It's not, I think, I will, maybe, I might, right? It's not even, I promise. A declaration is just declaring something as so. And if you think of that in terms of our Zen practice, what are we always trying to penetrate? What is actually so? What is here? What is here right now? We talk about we are all the awakened one, we are all Buddha, we just need to realize that or declare it and then live in accordance with that declaration. So when you think about declaration, it's powerful enough to create a new country. It's also powerful enough to completely recreate our lives and our relationship to everything in them, because we declare ourselves awakened and behave accordingly, not behave in some way that someday we might be awakened. You see the difference, right? We don't behave in some way that someday we may be realized, or that someday we may experience our Buddha nature, but we declare that this is so. I am here right now, awake and aware with all of you, and this is it, you know? And I declare that to be so. I declare myself to be the awakened one, and then I act accordingly. Now, this word independence also plays in. You know, we were walking the dog this morning, and I asked Lori, I said, do you know what the definition of, Deanne's probably good for this, she'll be Googling it faster than I can finish the sentence. Do you know what the actual definition of independence is? You know, and because we often think of free of, or free from, right? And Lori, without looking anything up, said, not dependent. And I thought that was, you know, an interesting view of independence, is not being dependent upon. So, you know, we declare our independence, just like, you know, back in 1776, the founders declared independence from what they saw as the tyranny and unfair representation and unfair taxation of a foreign royalty, right? We are no longer going to be dependent on that. We are going to operate in a way that is independent of that. And in the same way, in our Zen practice and in our lives, we can declare not being dependent upon. Which again, if you think about not being dependent on anything, that brings you immediately right into the moment. Because the moment is not dependent on anything. The moment just happened. The moment just happened. The moment just happened. There was no dependency. No dependency. And so then that can be a very freeing notion too. What do we want independence from? Why do many of us walk into a Zendo or any faith practice or pick up a self-help book or watch the latest Tony Robbins movie or whatever it is? What is it that we're looking for? So often it is not dependent on what? I'm so tired of being dependent about my own small beliefs about myself. I'm so tired of being dependent on my emotions and where they push me and where they take me. I'm so tired of being dependent on how I feel about how other people feel about me. Right? So there's this gaining independence or dependence, freedom from dependency on all of these things around us and all of our thoughts and beliefs and emotions. I'm so tired of anxiety and that interdependence I have with it. Okay? I did want to reference a classic koan on this, but I wanted to just start there. There's two very powerful actions we can take: declaration and declaration of our independence from. Because if we can free ourselves, what are the classic words? From greed, anger, and ignorance, we're told that that's the end of suffering. Right? And we practice that. Can I get some independence from suffering? Case 37 of the Book of Equanimity, Isan's Karmic Consciousness. Okay? So karma, the law of cause and effect. Taking out the farmer's ox, lead him by the nose. Snatching food from a starving man, clasp your hands around his throat. Is there anyone who can mete out such poisonous means? That's the preface. The main case, or the koan itself. Attention! Isan asked Kyozan, how would you examine someone who happens to ask you, all sentient beings have unceasing karmic consciousness, but there is no basis on which to depend? Kyozan replied, if this monk were to come, I would call him by name, saying, so-and-so. If the monk turned his head, I would say, what is that? I'd wait for him to hesitate, and then I'd say to him, not only is karmic consciousness unceasing, there's also no basis on which to depend. Isan remarked, good. So he got the seal of approval from the teacher. The appreciatory verse, call once and he turns his head. Does he know the self or not? The full moon imperceptibly turns to a crescent. When the child with a fortune in gold sinks low, the road of poverty subtly brings grief. Now the language in this koan is a little tricky. It's a little tricky to and I hesitated almost to do it because it's one of the trickier ones language-wise. How would you examine someone who happens to ask you, all sentient beings have unceasing karmic consciousness, but there is no basis on which to depend? Well, let's just simplify that a little bit. You know, karmic consciousness is just this notion that there is cause and effect, right? That actions have consequences, and consciousness of that karmic effect. The actions have consequences. But what is this? There is no basis on which to depend. This is really important. There is no basis on which to depend, meaning we can't count on any particular effect of any particular cause. You call out someone's name and they turn their head. Maybe, maybe not. You know? And in that turning of the head is their thought, is their consciousness. It's simply a turning of the head. We live a lot of our lives in what I call, in secular terms, and you know, I come from a programming and engineering background as well, but language has this built in too, is that big if-then equation. That big if-then equation. And our assumption that this if will create that then. And there's even a whole realm of reasoning, and we're puzzling problems out that we do, where we're like, well, let me figure this out. If I do this, then this will happen. If I do that, then this will happen. If I don't do this, this will happen, or this won't happen. And we tend to live our lives either consciously or subconsciously believing in this fixed if-then equation, as though we know that a particular if will always produce a specific then. And yet, in your own experience, is that true? Is that true? Do a good deed. Does good always result from a good deed? Steal something. Do you always end up in jail? Right? Well, Lori says in a way, but you know, she was raised a very good Christian. Right? She was. Yeah, and most of us were raised well. But there is no basis on which to depend, is pointing to things happen and they have effect, but there's not necessarily a written code about what produces what. Now let's take this to the positive side of creativity, or even enlightenment, or teaching, or coaching, or counseling, or creating art and music. If this if-then equation, if karma was a fixed equation, that would be somewhat of a dull world, wouldn't it? The color blue on this kind of paintbrush always produces this stroke. And this stroke always produces this image. And this image always produces this effect. It just doesn't work that way. You know? I can say to Lori, we had a relationship moment yesterday, as married couples of 31 years sometimes do. I can say to Lori, in one instance, I don't understand, and she'll go, okay, and explain. I can say I don't understand on another day, in another moment, and it becomes a problem. And I'm not making her wrong or me wrong. I'm just saying you can't count on the effect of anything. And yet, we do. We do. I was doing a little coaching with someone who's not a Zen student, but a long time colleague of mine, and Winston comes very much out of the analytical, logical world. And when I pointed out the fallibility of the if-then, he was like, oh my God, you just changed my day. You just changed my day. Because he had a religion of if-then. A religion of there's always a basis on which to depend, that everything is predictable and fixed. And if you let go of that, then the turn of a head is a turn of a head, and I love you is an I love you, a strike of the bell is a strike of the bell, and you don't know what comes next. Picking up the paintbrush is a wide open endeavor. Sitting down at the keyboard is a wide open endeavor. Any conversation is a wide open endeavor. And you notice that when he says, I would call him or her by name saying, Chalet. And if she responded, I'd say, what is that? Okay, that's a testing question in true Zen Right, it's like working with a student. I call Chalet and she looks up and I go, what is that? And she's probably going to look at me like I'm a little bit crazy. What do you mean, what is that? But it's in that moment, I think, what is that? What is that? It's me lifting my head when my name was called. And yet, in this if-then structure, we're always looking for reason, right? Because our understanding of karma often is that things happen for a reason, right? That this cause-effect, that there's some judgment and reason, or good and bad in all of it, rather than just cause and effect. Cause and effect. So this can create a lot of freedom or independence when we start understanding this and we start letting go of the if-then. Some of the teaching I'm doing in Austin, this is with public teachers and school districts and superintendents, and an effort to create better leadership within the Texas public school system. And one of the modules I'm teaching is called Wisdom. And in the Wisdom module, one of the things we cover is mastering emotions. Okay, and mastering's a little bit of a funny word. I'm not sure it's the right word, right? Because it feels like, I've mastered them. I think actually freedom from or independence of emotion might be better, especially in the context of this talk. And so I will take everybody through, a few of the standard emotions like anger, anxiety, and optimism, and we'll break down, the pros and cons of each. Right? Is anger always bad? No. Anger can be a great force for getting things done. Is it always good? No. Is anxiety always bad? Mark says yes. And yet, I think it was Rihanna that said, if I weren't anxious before going on stage, I would be very anxious. Anxiety actually can fuel. Beyonce. Anxiety can heighten our awakeness, our awareness, our performance, right? And yet too much anxiety can shut us down. But is anxiety in itself bad? No. But it's how do you dance with anxiety? Okay, and this is very much the realm of Zen again. How do you dance with the occurrences of your life? How do you dance with things as they come to you? And then the final one is optimism. Everybody's like, well, optimism is good. And it can be, but it can also be very delusional. And if you're an optimist against all odds and everything's falling around and you're like, it's okay, you start losing, there we go with that voice again. It seems to me always make people laugh, so I'm just going to keep using that voice every once in a while. It's okay. You just need to meditate more. No, it's optimism. That kind of optimism in a leader can actually create lack of trust. Because they don't seem to be grounded in reality, right? And so we look at the emotions, and then we start talking about how do you have freedom from emotions, and then we dip a little bit into cognitive behavioral therapy and that, and Sharma's shaking her head now, and that, there's an event, and then there's behavior, and then we typically think that in between something happening and a behavior and there's an emotion, that causes the behavior. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT for short, says that, well, actually, there's thought in there. And that thought has a huge effect on the emotion and the emotional response or behavior. And so then with these people, none of whom are, Zen students, of course, we start saying, well, what are those thoughts and what's wrong with them? And so and one model for thoughts that get us into a lot of trouble, and here we go with the if-then equation again, right, are called automatic negative thoughts. Like something happens and what's your default? Oh, I never understand this kind of thing. I don't get it. I'm not good enough, right? Or I've got this. On the other hand, then that's not a negative thought, but automatic thoughts, right? What is that default thing that you do? And then we look at distortions, like distortions that affect thought. Okay, so this is again all very secular, right? But there's mind reading and fortune telling and emotional reasoning, right? Mind reading is that I know why Tennessee's looking at me that way right now. I must have said something wrong or something that wasn't clear, right? But I actually have no idea what's going on in her head, or look how simple it is. Sometimes you're walking down the hall and somebody looks at your shoes and all of a sudden you go into the, what's wrong with my shoes? I guess I'm not, well, yeah, that's right. I'm not very into fashion. I wonder if that's going to work in a career in advertising, right? Something happens, we start having thoughts about it. Often those thoughts are distorted, and then all hell breaks loose. And the emotion has its claws in us. The if-then equation, our notion of karma, has its claws in us because all of a sudden we're locked into if-then. Now, the great thing about being a Zen practitioner is you're much faster at seeing those thoughts than somebody that has not embarked in this training, because that's what we do. Be awake, be aware, what's going on right here, right now, versus what am I thinking is going on right here, right now. And we start creating some independence from that thinking mind. And then we can choose whether to depend on it or not at will. So we need to solve a problem, we depend on it. It's leading us astray, we declare our independence. Happy 4th of July for your true self. That's worth some fireworks. It's worth some fireworks. Being able to have that kind of independence from all the places our mind tries to push us and take us and get its hooks into us, declaring some independence from that. Those thoughts are not me. Because you really look at the thoughts, right? They're this continual ongoing stream. But if you're looking at the thoughts, who's the observer? If you could see the thoughts, obviously you're not the thoughts. And then it gets very spiritual and godlike if you keep stepping that back. We've talked about this before. Once you clearly see the observer, observe the observer. And think about that, right? Okay, so there are my thoughts. Wait a minute, who's seeing the thoughts? And you start watching that one who's seeing the thoughts. And then you back it up again. Who's the observer of the observer? And if you go far enough and deep enough with this, you end up in emptiness. And it all blows wide open. And there's no basis on which to depend. Now, another way of there's no basis on which to depend, you can view it, is if everything is one big codependency, and not in a psychological sense, but if we are all related and all connected, and I am connected to everything just as it is right now, right? I and all things, 10,000 things in the 10 directions are one. How can you be dependent on anything if there's no separation? Because dependent on has to have subject and object. So our practice also brings us right into pure relationship in which there can be no dependence or independence. I know that's a little bit of a mind bender, but if you take two things and bring them together so that they are one, that's why we hold our hands like this, by the way, then there's nothing to depend on. There is no other. In a relationship moment like we had yesterday, and we fail at this all the time, by the way. That's why we keep practicing. If Lori and I had been able to look at each other and just go, there's not Lori and Dan, there's not husband and wife here, and just like really, if we had taken the time to just, go into each other's eyes, how could we possibly have continued the argument? Instead, what did we do? I went one direction, she went the other direction. Delusion, splitting of the light. And it's not until you bring that light back together that things resolve. Anyway, I thought it would be, here we are celebrating independence, the Declaration of Independence, and the two words and concepts I think can be very powerful at a personal level, not just a country and historical level. Declare yourself into the state of independence from that thinking mind, from the beliefs, from the anxiety, from the thoughts, emotions, from the separation. Just declare your independence from it. Now, countries, like people, fail at this. And if you read the newsletter, you'll notice at the very end I said celebrate the intention. Because it would be pure folly to say that the United States has arrived at the perfect state, of all men are created equal. First of all, it says all men, but are we all created equal? Yes. Is it playing out that way all the time? My opinion, no. Is there work to be done? Yes. And so we start right here with the work right here, because if we don't get this right, how can we get that right? If Lori and I are still walking away from each other in two opposite directions, it's just a silly little tiff. What do we do when we're confronted with somebody we don't even know out in the real world? Sometimes that's easier, right? Sometimes that's actually easier. Sometimes we have more generosity for the people not close to us. Another thing to work on. But what is that based on? That's based on an assumption of karmic consequence. That's based on the if-then equation. That's based on husband and wife having solidified some if-then equation rather than breaking it up and declaring independence from that. If you do this, I do that. It's kind of cool, I think. It gives me hope. It gives me hope for the next 31 years of our marriage. That would put us way out there. It's a little scary. The Dharma talk would be kind of like this, Anyway. Lori says it's coming really soon. Well, no, that would be 31 years from now. Maybe somebody else will be doing the Dharma talk by now. I think I'll end there. Happy 4th of July, happy Independence Day. And I hope you take some of this talk and play with that Declaration of Independence. Practice it for yourselves, for each and every one of us. There is no basis on which to depend. Isan remarked, good. Good. Be okay with what happens and act appropriately. Act in accordance. Don't assume too much. Okay, so I'll end my Dharma rant there. And I know that everybody may have 4th of July plans, but let's see if there are any questions or comments, and go from there. I will leave the recording on just so that if somebody who is in our Sangha wants to hear discussion, we can decide whether to share that or not. But again, in terms of posting it, we'll respect all of your various privacies. Okay, so any questions, comments, answers?